first of all, we have to understand that the ceasefire is not simply about exchange of prisoners. And that's very important to understand. There are other aspects to the ceasefire that nobody mentioned, and namely, a very important aspect, especially for the Palestinians, is the return of humanitarian aid. And in the ceasefire agreement, you have some elements to the humanitarian aid to be fulfilled by the Israelis. So I think we have to understand that way, because we tend to see the problem just related to exchange of prisoners, but it's broader than this. And the reason why the Hamas decided to freeze the exchange of prisoners is because, on his part, Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract. Again, we are back to exactly what we have said many times. Israel refuses to abide by the agreement they signed. And that's exactly what we have now. And now, of course, nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about the shortfall in this humanitarian aid. As a result, what we see in the media is that Hamas will freeze the exchange of prisoners. Therefore, it's their fault. You see? So we always know only one part of the reality. And that's extremely vicious in a certain sense, or perverse, because in fact, we are giving a blank check for Israel to resume military operations against the Palestinians. So that's the first remark. And that's where the media play a very, very bad role in the whole crisis, because they tend to ignore a part of the facts in order to portray the Palestinians as those who fail to abide by international law. They are terrorists after all, and all that, and that creates a situation where, of course, if you see the situation like this, if you discard all the aspects that Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract. The second remark is that since Israel claims that he wants to destroy Hamas and all that, and what we have seen so far is that Hamas has been reinvigorated by the situation. It has gained popular support across the world. Israel has lost the credibility it had around the world. So what exactly the Americans want to achieve by resuming military operation, or just sending the hell on in Gaza? You know, I'm not exactly sure what is the objective of what Trump said, and what Netanyahu said, by the way. So that means that there is not a single square meter of Israel that has been acquired legally by Israel. Everything has been taken by force. So if you're Palestinian today, you see that you are expelled by brutal force from place to place. And in addition to that, the guy who expels you, in fact, is not sanctioned in any way. So how can you see the situation without having some anger? And that's probably what Donald Trump misses in assessing the situation. Now, as to the plan itself, again, it doesn't solve the problem. It just kicks the can down the road, because again, the problem is not for the Palestinians to have a place. In fact, there have been several proposals that have been made in the past, even by Saudi Arabia, if I'm not wrong, to have these the refugees, or at least some of them, on their territory. So the problem is not the space The problem is that you are on the territory, the place where you were born, and you are expelled from that place. And this is a question of justice, this is a question of humanity, and this is a question of international law. So the problem with Gaza, with the Palestinian, is not that they don't have a house. I mean, obviously it's a problem for the Palestinian, but that's not the essence. The problem is that they don't have a territory. And it's not that they don't have a territory. It's that they don't have their territory. In addition to that, we could even say that their territory is not even what is in Gaza, but what is outside Gaza, because most of the inhabitants of Gaza originate from those refugees of 1948 from the Nakba. And these people used to live in the southern part of Israel. They were repelled in this area, which is today called Gaza. But this area didn't exist before. You know, it's a huge refugee camp that was created by the Israelis, essentially. And what adds to the problem is that Israel continues on the same path since 80 years without being sanctioned by the international community, although it was stated on many documents, resolutions. There are almost 100 resolutions of the United Nations that condemn the action of Israel. And these resolutions do not condemn Israel because they are Jews. They condemn Israel because Israel is not behaving according to the international law, and took over territories illegally. As I said, the starting point of all that is, of course, Resolution 181 of 29th of November 1947. And if you read this document, you would say that, in fact, Israel could build, I mean, you could have those two countries, an Arab state and a Jewish state, but based on referendum, based on consultation of population. And to avoid that, Israel just took over the territory. And it took over not after 1948, but before 1948, between November 1947 to May 1948. And even if you read the memories or the memoir of David Ben Gurion, he said that in May 1948, they had even taken more territory than the territory that was proposed in this possible partition plan that was annexed to the resolution of 1947. So here is the problem. You know, of course they would like to have a better life, that's for sure, and they would certainly welcome to have nice buildings and a nice flat screen TVs and all that, no doubt. But this is not the essence. The essence is that they were expelled from their own homes and villages 80 years ago, and now they took refuge in this area, and now they are expelled again from this area. The problem is with Trump, and you have exactly the same thing with Ukraine, by the way, that I think, I mean, to his credit, we can say he wants to solve situations. And that's already something. He wants to do something, which is fine. The problem is that when you do something, you need to have a very clear and exact, a precise picture of the situation. What is at stake, really? And my understanding is that for both Ukraine and Gaza, Trump doesn't have, he has a rough picture of the situation, but not a precise picture of what is at stake for Israel, what is at stake for the Palestinians, same as you have in Ukraine, by the way, because it started to come with a plan or something that you can call a plan, maybe. The word plan could be put in quotation marks, but anyway, at least an idea if you want. Apparently, what I've heard, and no, I'm not able to assess that very precisely, but apparently he was reading a document when he made this declaration. He was reading a document that was written by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Now, meaning that he's probably not very familiar with the nitty-gritty of the issue. He was probably it's just in his mind. Well, there are a lot of question marks with this proposal because, first of all, we don't know exactly what he's aiming at, because sometimes he said he wanted uh, to make Gaza better. We don't know exactly for whom. Is that for the Palestinians or for real estate agents or Israelis? We don't really know. He wanted to buy the area. He wanted to rebuild the area. He wanted to send Palestinians temporarily in Egypt or Jordan. And sometimes it's the word temporarily seemed to disappear. So it's not very clear what he wants. But we see that this idea is not one-to-one implementable, because many factors have been just discarded. It's a simplified picture of the situation. It has somehow a cartoonish understanding of the situation. So a lot of details have disappeared. And you probably have an additional factor that came to the surface, especially in the last 1 year and a half of the operation in Gaza. It's that it has become absolutely apparent for the whole world that Israel is not abiding by the international law. You know, prior to that, you had Israel bombing Gaza from time to time, but they're saying, "Oh, they are terrorists, so we can bomb them," and everybody was happy, even in the West. Nobody questioned that. Today, the problem is slightly different, because it has gained such a dimension that it's no longer possible to ignore the blatant violation of the international law. In addition to that, Netanyahu has been indicted by the international. And of course, you have these proceedings going into the International Court of Justice, meaning that we know today, and it's obvious for everybody, regardless of who you are. I mean, obviously, you have people that don't have bad faith who would not understand that. But let's say for the majority of the population of the world, it's clear that Israel is not respecting the law, the international humanitarian law. And so these are the essential reason for this. And finally, no, there is also something important that would be contrary to the international law, because you cannot have create permanent refugee camps in some places, and Israel using its neighbors to create permanent refugee camps. So that would be against the international law. The next question would be, who would fund that? So there's absolutely no reason whatsoever for the Egyptians and the Jordanians to accept that. The advantage of the Hamas and Palestinians is that, in essence, they are stronger than the Israelis, and they have the public opinion support that they didn't have before. That's why it's very important to make the shortfalls that I have mentioned before, to make them known to the public, so that people understand that the Palestinians are not simply stopping the exchange of prisoners just for the sake of stopping. They stop because they have a reason for that. And the reason is that Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract. So we are in a kind of situation. I mean, the Netanyahu has a culture of vengeance. And we have seen that, by the way they behave. For instance, when after the 7th of October, they started to revenge against other Palestinians, namely the West Bank or other places, or they started revenge against the Lebanese and all that. So it's a culture of revenge. It's a culture that extends beyond Israel, by the way. We have to take these threats very seriously. But at the same time, I think we need to make clear that the Hamas so far has always been extremely prudent with its actions, and has always complied with all the agreements that were signed with Israel in the past, even before the 7th of October. It's always the Israelis who broke the agreement. And by the way, I have read today that as of today, Israel has broken 257 times the ceasefire. So there is this idea of provocation by the Israelis. And probably I can even assume that the absence or the lack of humanitarian aid deliveries is part of a plan, because they know that the Palestinians will have to react to that. And therefore, they can use that as a pretext to resume operations. So, and now I think we are exactly in a similar situation. The Israelis retain humanitarian aid they were supposed to deliver to Gaza in order to provoke the Palestinians to now. And then, of course, it's a very tricky game, because how would you react if you were Palestinians? If you identify the game of the Israelis, you would say, okay, we still continue to we exchange the prisoners and we do as if the situation were normal. But the problem is that the situation, and that will not encourage Israelis to fulfill their obligations, because they never did that before. So you're in a kind of a trap somehow. I mean, I wouldn't exclude that, because in the past they have constantly do that. You know, when we talk about Hamas, we talk about a terrorist group, and when you ask why, how can you define it as terrorist? And the answer is that Hamas shoots rockets on Israel, but nobody asks why do they shoot rockets. I tried to make this research, and I studied every single major launch of rockets that have been launched by Hamas and other Palestinian factions, because in fact the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was the first group to use missiles or rockets against Israel. In any case, I studied that, and I saw that in every single case, the rockets were launched after Israel broke a ceasefire by bombing people or civilians on the Gaza Strip. Invariably. It's systematic. But nobody says that. As a result, we have this picture of Hamas that randomly shoot at people, by the way, killing very few people. If you read my book on the Al-Aqsa flood, I show statistics of the people killed, and you see that the Palestinians, in fact, kill almost nobody in Israel with those rockets. They just want to react. They just want to show that they don't accept to be fired at without replying. So they reply. It's always a response. It's not a deliberate act of destruction. And that can be documented. And therefore, I think Trump is a little bit too optimistic when he thinks that he has still a lot of leverage. They still have some leverage. It's not that they don't have any, but they might be. Now you have Iran and Saudi Arabia that basically have good relations. Iran has received the fighters from Russia. At the end of the day, probably fighters, those aircraft coming from China or from Russia are probably more reliable, less expensive, and probably less subjected to political variation and decision that you have in Washington. So, this leverage is reducing at very high speed. And again, I don't know. And again, that doesn't mean that there is absolutely no leverage from that Trump can use. But I would say that people don't trust him. All the declaration he made about Gaza, that doesn't engage countries to consider Trump as a credible partner. That's my personal view. And therefore, if you have a weapon like the F-35, for instance, you'd better to be an ally of the US, because otherwise they can just prevent you to use your own aircraft. I remember when I was in NATO, I met a guy who was a test pilot for it was a Dutch test pilot of the F-35, and he told us, he said, well, if the US wants us to stop using the aircraft, they were just to turn a button and that's it. You cannot use them. So meaning that when you know that, and the same applies to Patriot missiles, THAAD systems, and all that, when you buy your weapons in the US, what is the guarantee you have that you can use these weapons in case of a conflict against Israel, for instance? And I'm not even talking about the quality of technology, which today, when it comes to armament, probably today is probably not in every respect, but in many respects, the balance of quality in terms of armaments is probably in favor of Russia, probably China as well. So, when you see that from far, you would say, well, the West is no longer the West. There is, within the West, there is a relationship between powers which is based on who is the more powerful. It's a power struggle within the Western bloc itself. So how can you trust these people? They have crumbling economies. They have crumbling political systems. All these countries, France, Germany, UK, Italy, even the US to some extent, have budgetary problems. They are not even able to manage their own countries, and they want to manage other countries. How can you trust such country? Meaning that it's not to say that US has no capability of leverage. US has still an influence. I mean, the dollar, even if we talk about de-dollarization and all that, the dollar remains so far the most used currency when it comes to trade, international trade, and all that. So that and that will stay that way for a while now. But the trend is changing direction, and everybody understands that. And everybody understands that the future belongs to Asia. And therefore, it's probably at this stage, it's a good idea to shift slowly towards the West. And we see that the West, first of all, the West, I mentioned before that the world is split between the West and the rest of the world. But it's not exactly true, because if you look at the West is split today. There is no common position about Palestine, about Ukraine, about NATO. Now you have the EU wanting to create its own small NATO somehow, because they don't trust NATO, because in NATO you have the US and they don't trust the US. And the US is put tariffs on all these friends. Canada is a NATO ally, and others, Germany and Japan and all that. Which, of course, Japan is not part of NATO, but the US is putting tariffs and punishing, in essence, their own allies. And the ability, for instance, of the West of supporting Ukraine, even supporting Israel, because at the end they provided bombs, okay, but they didn't provide any solution to solve the situation. They are not problem solvers. The West do not solve problems. They create problems. They generate problems. They have brought the Middle East into chaos, in Iraq, in Syria, everywhere. They never came up with a solution. So when you see that from the Middle East, what kind of picture do you have? You have a picture of countries that are bragging around that they are the best and all that, but beyond this, nothing concrete come out of this. No, when we talk about, again, I repeat myself, but when you talk about both Ukraine and Palestine, where are the Europeans? This fantastic European Union with all its values, its economic power and all that, where are they? They are totally absent from the diplomatic scene. They are totally absent from any solution, both in Ukraine and in Palestine. So what kind of credibility do you have? The West has, in the last 30 years or so, the West has not demonstrated any ability to be constructive. We have been destructive. We have destroyed everything, but we haven't built anything. And that's obvious with Ukraine. And Ukrainians themselves understand that. And it becomes almost like a joke to some extent, because Ukrainians start to realize that they have been framed by the Europeans and the US. That everything that was promised was, in fact, could not be kept. You know, the US and the Europeans said they would help Ukraine as long as it takes. And now they say as long as we can. And we see that the West has no longer the military capabilities, the industrial capabilities, the financial capabilities, the budgetary capabilities to support Ukraine as they promised. And that's the kind of problem. And you have more and more that's the reason why China has gained so much, let's say, credibility in Africa, because China has understood that if it wants to improve trade with Africa, let's say, that applies to other continents as well, but let's talk about Africa because that's a continent I know. And I lived in two countries that used to be, at that time, the most important presence of China on the African continent, namely Sudan and Kenya. We have a different geopolitical situation. And we see that, of course, with the whole issue of tariffs and all that. But we see that the world is more and more split in two parts. The West, and even the West starts to be very divided because of these tariffs and all that. But there's the West and the rest of the world. And All these countries, take Saudi Arabia, for instance, that wants to develop new technologies, new energy solutions, and all that because they know that sooner or later they will not have oil anymore at one point, probably not very soon, but in any case, they have to prepare for that. Who is the leading power when it comes to new technologies and all that? China. Who is the power that tries or that has the ability or even the willingness sometimes to direct your own economy by preventing export or sanctioning and all that? US. And if you see, for instance, the attempts from Trump to force Saudi Arabia to lower its the price of oil so that that could make some pressure on Russia and all that, he received a flat no. Because today, all these countries, they know that they will have more to gain with the Eurasian bloc, let's say, and mainly China, but not only. But also the USSR with Russia, because Russia is also a provider of commodities and all that. So, meaning that they have an alternative. They don't need to have the United States. This idea that US should prevail all the time because they are simply the best, they have the best scientists, the best economists, the best money, the best whatever. This is a little bit a picture of the past. So the tendency today, what you see across the South, the global South, as we can say it, is that they try to escape the dollar. They try to escape the United States because the United States are, in fact, are a destabilizing factor in reality. And everybody tries to escape that, meaning that the leverage that the US has on these Middle East leaders. Just let's talk about the Abraham Accords or these normalization agreement with Israel and all that. In his first mandate, Donald Trump tried to bring Saudi Arabia and others to normalize their relationship with Israel. And they started to draft agreements. In these agreements, the so-called Abraham Accords or agreements, there was no mention of the Palestinian question. But today, Saudi Arabia has said clearly, if there is no Palestinian state, or if the question is not raised or put as a condition of the treaty, we will not normalize our relationship with Israel. And it's very clear. This is very clear. Now, is this idea doable? I don't think so. The outrage that appeared in the media around the world after what Trump said, I think is a signal for the US that it's probably not the right way to go. We have to remember, I'm ready to give some credit to Donald Trump because at least he's trying to do something, which is something positive compared to what we have seen before. But at the same time, Trump is not very much appreciated in the world. Not even because with the tariff policy that he's applying, and everybody starts to hate Trump now. But also beyond that, I mean, Trump was not very much. Nobody liked him as he came in his first presidential term. And today it's probably a little bit better because obviously in the United States, the American population wanted a change and wanted someone who could improve a situation that was clearly deteriorated during the Biden mandate. So they wanted to have an improvement. And based on that, we can say that at least in the US, the legitimacy of Donald Trump is definitely improved, and probably around the world also. But at the same time, Trump is still Trump. He makes a declaration, and I'm not sure that what he says is always well thought. He's kind of a hip shooter, you know, and that makes him kind of a that let's say he doesn't have a huge of credibility because of that. And Trump is starting to understand also. I made the comparison with the Ukrainian issue, and I think on both theaters, uh, Trump and his team starts to understand that situations are a little bit more complex than what they figured out before, and therefore they need to deepen a little bit make a little bit more homework to come up with practicable solutions to solve the problem. And for that reason, when it comes up with project or ideas such as the one he proposed for Gaza, I think it's not credible for most people. And I think he understands that. And for me, this plan is probably something that will remain in the air, because obviously Netanyahu has understood that this is an option that would fit perfectly in his views. So we can admit that Netanyahu will continue with this idea, but I'm not sure the Americans will. Again, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is leading nowhere. And we need to see. You remember, for Ukraine, he wanted to stop the conflict within 24 hours, and then it was like 100 days, and now everybody understands that it's probably not even 100 days. Anyway, so what I mean is that the Trump team needs to mature. And they're probably brilliant people with good ideas, and at least they are less willing to engage into kind of perpetual, permanent wars around the globe and things like this, which is, I think, a positive thing. But to solve the problem, since they engage, I think they still need to do some homework to understand better the situation, to understand better what is at stake for both parties, not just one, and to get out of those thick narrative that we had in the West, to trying to figure out the situations with very simplistic views, that you have the bad Hamas and the bad Russians and the good Ukrainians and the good Israelis and all that. And we see that all that is collapsing because this narrative is not in tune with reality. And therefore, there is a lot of work to be done by the Trump administration to get on the top of that.